Mondays with Mike is a podcast by two friends from the Seattle area. Originally intended as a news analysis podcast, as of spring 2025, it has lately mostly covered current events. Show notes can be found at mondayswithmike.ddns.net. Mondays with Mike is your weekly helping of opinion and critical analysis of the day's news. Bud asks the questions, and Mike supplies the takes. Start a social revolution. Make friends with your neighbor. Disagree without being disagreeable. And remember, if it's Mondays, it's with Mike. Harvard versus Trump.
Yes.
The guy in the video said, at Harvard, we have a real problem with anti-Semitism. I didn't expect him to say that, but okay. Yet the Trump administration is targeting DEI, and they want a say over who is hired and fired at Harvard. Seems unprecedented, and like an overreach, dare I say. Harvard says that its problems with anti-Semitism on campus are unrelated to the funding it receives for research. What are the implications of the battle between Harvard and Trump? What do you think?
Oh, it's titanic. The implications are really profound. Yes, it is unprecedented. Harvard's a private university. A similar parallel would be as if the Trump administration tried to tell a private corporation they could hire or fire and want control over the direction of their company, any number of other things. So it is unprecedented for sure. But the implications are dramatic. Harvard's the university with the largest endowment in the country. It has the power to fight back if it wants to. And if it capitulated immediately, it would spell a really bad future for academic freedom in the country, because this is something new. For one thing, all these grants and loans and money that they're receiving from the federal government for research, those were all through different agencies, right? That people had to write grants for, they had to apply in a competitive grant process for, they had to get their grants reviewed. A lot of the money they're taking away is for medical research. So that's stuff like curing cancer or Alzheimer's, or the list goes on of things that the university is researching that have absolutely no bearing on this disagreement between what the Trump administration is trying to impose on Harvard and what Harvard's doing in response to that imposition. Effectively, this is the government doing far-reaching punishment for Harvard saying no. And that's something very new. But also, it's individual lives, right? Because each of these individual professors are their own little sort of unit. When we're talking about research, they run their own labs, they have their own little area of study. And so just because somebody decides to work for Harvard or gets hired to work for Harvard doesn't mean that they themselves don't have separate individual rights in regards to their funding getting taken away, because this is their careers, this is their livelihoods, this is their research and their freedom. And we're talking about First Amendment implications of professors choosing what to study and the government effectively stepping in and saying, oh, we approved giving you money so you could study this, but just kidding, you're not going to get it anymore. That's my whole gripe. That's been with all this other Doge stuff where they're canceling these research contracts and grants, because these are all individual people that have rights separate from the institution. Yes, you may work for somewhere, or you may work for an employer, or you may work for a university, but you're also a person. And anyways, that's my thought, is that each of these individual people could sue for redress of grievance, and probably should, if they had to go through a competitive process to prove a proof of concept or something, or to apply some kind of competitive manner where someone decided to give them money after they went through that ordeal. I would sue if I was in that situation, because think of it, this is these people's lives, their livelihoods. They spend their whole lives studying and working and studying and working. I know people who worked in scientific labs. They devote their entire life to it, right? You have to commit. We're talking 12-hour days.
Great deal of specificity on a particular task, and a great deal of focus on a particular realm of research, and if it stops for a little while, much of that might be in vain. But what about the anti-Semitism? Do you think that American universities are running like, here's what they might characterize it as. Like that there's bigotry and that somebody's got to do something about it. And what about that? What needs to happen? If we think that this is overreach, what wouldn't be overreach?
Okay, I'll give you an example of what wouldn't be overreach. What the State Department's doing of focusing on specific protesters who engage in behavior that they can identify as criminal or that infringe on the rights of others. It's completely within their power as the State Department to say, okay, we offered you the opportunity to study in the US. You decided to say, nah, gonna snub the values of the country and ignore the laws. Okay, here's the door, right? There is an argument to be made that, at least in some of these cases, of the Secretary of State saying we're revoking the visa of these students, that those students engage in activities that superseded the bounds of what they were allowed to do. In particular, I'm thinking of Colombia, where they occupied a building and had to be removed forcibly by a SWAT team. Okay, that's excessive, right? There's protest and then there's trespassing and forcibly blocking people from going to their homes or their place of employment. That is a distinction where I don't think it would be overreach. If they can prove in court, right? I guess it's at the discretion of the Secretary of State, but ideally they'd have a process where they could say, this is the allegation, you can challenge the allegation. If the evidence doesn't prove out, goodbye. What is overreach is punishing everybody who wasn't involved in any of that. Scientists studying diseases, people who've spent 20 years studying something just to have the funding cut at the last second, people with live specimens like animals and that they test on, like monkeys in a cage or mice or whatever, where if they get the funding cut, they may have to euthanize the animals because they don't have the money to keep them safely stored or in a facility, right? Like that, overreach 100%. What's not overreach is going after these specific instances and enforcing the law, right? Universities aren't an island on their own. The people who engage in these practices are subject to the same exact laws against harassment. And remember, free speech isn't all speech. It's something that I learned in college and has stuck with me forever. Is there are some things you just can't say because it's not free speech.
Yeah, like fighting words or I'm gonna blow up XYZ.
Stuff that shouldn't be said, period, in any context because it can be misconstrued. Almost definitely, these people are advocating, these protesters are advocating for something that isn't protected speech. And that distinction is really important because without that distinction, then it does seem like overreach. But with that distinction, it's just recognition that, look, there are some things that people aren't allowed to advocate for, period. It's just the way it is in a civilized society. It's how it goes. But where I think there was overreach by far is punishing the whole university for this, right? If it's a problem of enforcement, then go after those who are the enforcers, right? So if somebody made a decision not to enforce the law, figure out who and why, and then have a chat with them and say, hey, maybe you should start enforcing the law more with the campus police, or you should allow federal authorities to have a more increased role. But what I don't like is this whole notion of punishing the entire community. If you follow the line of logic that the Trump administration is using, then when the people in Google protested, for instance, they stood up at a meeting and protested Israel, and then Google fired them. By the logic of the Trump administration, they should also take all the funding from Google. And I don't like that notion at all because it's essentially punishing by association, just by virtue of universities are huge businesses, right? They have lots of moving parts, lots of people who live there and work there.
Yeah, it's like Cleveland. Somebody in Cleveland said something mean. Punish Cleveland. No.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the exact problem. Is it's not one person does something, so all must suffer. No way. Absolutely not.
So this sort of thinking that goes on, I presume it goes on Fox News. There's this great big anti-American movement or whatever. But in reality, it's just there's no unified entity that you can't just group everybody opposed to the Trump agenda as the faction that hates America because there's no faction. They don't agree with each other on hardly anything, much less working in concert. There's this idea that, there's these anti-Semitic people on campus. They and the university administrators, they're really playing for the same team, ain't they? And no, they're not. You say it right. There's advocable positions, essentially. I can't say, oh, hey, that Genghis Khan did a great thing. Let's get more guys like that. Nope. No, we live in a civilized world. But most people are not doing that. The imagination that occurs that it's some sort of multi-headed hydra going on and that you can punish all to get at one. It's ridiculous. You should just tackle the illegal behavior or advocacy where it occurs. I think we agree on that.
It's also being used as a pretext, right, to try and justify these huge, sweeping, very new kinds of approaches to addressing these issues. Because here's the deal. It's not even clear that the Trump administration can revoke all this money that's in some cases has been appropriated by Congress. They're just doing it. And that's why I think Harvard is suing against the action. It's because it's not entirely clear on what authority they're justifying revoking billions of dollars. Because usually to revoke money on this level, you have to do a sort of case by case review and come up with reasons and justifications. You can't just cancel something that's after money's already been granted. That was the whole issue in these first 100 days. The Trump administration did two big actions. They cut off foreign loans and grants through USAID, and then they tried to stop all domestic grants and loans for everyone. And that almost immediately had an administrative hold by, I think it was a handful of judges, and that hold is still in effect, right? The Trump administration has not been able to stop all domestic grants and loans because we're talking about trillions of dollars. We're talking about so much money over multiple administrations, multiple generations of legislators. Just to give an example, there was a bridge in Washington that they've been working on for, I think, 25 years. And if they cut the money right at the last second of this huge multi-decade infrastructure project, oh boy, that's an issue. And it's not so clear that the authority is even there. But what is clear is that the Trump administration is doing this thing where they just do stuff. And then if somebody sues back or they go to court, then they back down a bit. But they seem to be trying to push the bounds of what the executive can do just to see if they can do it. And we're seeing that with the El Salvador thing, with just deporting people to a country without due process. They just did it. And the judge said, bring them around. They said, nah, not going to do that. And so they brought them to El Salvador. And we're seeing that play out in all these different ways. So that's one of the things. In terms of overreach, though, it's a huge deal that they're trying to essentially expropriate private property at this point. Because if they've given the money, if the government gives you money and then they take it back after the fact, it's effectively taking something from you, right? And so that's its whole separate issue. We're seeing that actually seriously play out, and I don't know how it's been resolved with the U.S. Institute for Peace, where they had a private headquarters that they raised the money for themselves, and Doge came in and tried to take the headquarters, their $500 million headquarters, and just gift it to themselves, which I don't know how that's playing out, but that was just like, whoa, that's a big seizure for a private nonprofit. We're seeing this in Florida right now, the allegation against DeSantis that there was some money given in a trial for Medicaid fraud or something, and then it was diverted to political campaigning. What is that? That's crazy.
Could be fraud. Could be.
Who knows? That's still playing. That's allegedly, right? That's still playing out in court.
Could. Yeah.
Yeah, it's alleged. But oh man, if that was money that was meant to go towards people on Medicaid or towards health services or something, and it went towards a political campaign, that's not good. That's bad.
That does not look good, not at all. No. And moreover, okay, so there's hundreds of newspapers. If it was one newspaper, but it's the principle of it. So if the administration said, we want to control hiring and firing for a newspaper or for a TV network, we'd know. So we'd say, nope.
So they're trying. That's what the lawsuit against 60 Minutes is. They're trying to interfere with the programming of 60 Minutes. I think it was a 20 billion, 26 billion. It was way up there for the damages they're pursuing against 60 Minutes. And it's just, it looks like overreach. Let's just say that.
And you might think if it's for a newspaper, hiring and firing decisions, that's First Amendment. But in terms of what is going to influence people's thinking more, newspaper or a university? Given the age at which they go to a university, it's probably the university, would be my thinking. Albeit the professors have their own discretion, so not necessarily, but the sum total of the university upon its students would certainly be greater on average than a newspaper. So really we're talking about similar things.
Harvard has a newspaper. They have the Harvard
Right.
Crimson, which is a student run, as far as I know, it's a student run newspaper, but I wonder where they get their funding from if the Trump administration tried to revoke their funding, right? Who knows? The last thing I'll say is that it sends a terrible message if the US is promoting democracy and freedom and human rights and civil liberties abroad, but then it's making serious efforts to try and constrain academic freedom domestically for the oldest and one of the wealthiest universities in the country that predates the country. It's older than the founding of the country. It sends a really bad message when one of the glittering jewels of the academic Mount Olympus, as it were, the ivory tower, is being besieged by the government instead of being lauded or being promoted abroad as look at how amazing America is. We've got this huge, successful university that draws the best and the brightest from around the world. That's just my point. That it's bad marketing.
Bad for brand America. Okay, Real ID. I don't know why I have an issue with this exactly, but I've heard it for a long time, and I think to myself, if the state knows where I live, etc., okay. But if the federal government knows it from the same source, or it has to be an integrated database, maybe I'm less free. That's just my impulse. I don't know why it's my impulse. But anyway, so this month, or in about 2 weeks, although there might be a delay, Real ID, you're going to need a Real ID in order to fly on a plane. As far as flying on a plane goes, fine. I already have a passport. I'll just use that. Yeah, what do you think of Real ID?
I think it's a necessary tool for security reasons, frankly, because the problem with how state IDs were being issued is that some IDs were going to people that had no documentation really. You were seeing that play out in some of these states. I think New York had it where they were giving driver's licenses to people who were undocumented immigrants, right? So that meant that people who didn't have a good paper trail of when they got into the country. This goes back to a discussion we had actually a few episodes ago that one of the big issues with undocumented migration is that people can come into the country who we know nothing about. We know very little about and are unable to trace their country of origin, their job history, their criminal history, and that poses certain problems because we've seen what a failure of understanding where people are from and what they do and their background. We've seen in our lifetimes what can happen when we have those intelligence failures. It happened in broad daylight. Thousands of people died. And so the whole reason for why Real ID exists is because of that kind of failure, is that there's a huge number of people that we know very little about. And if you allow them to travel on commercial airliners, it poses a great risk. And it's a risk that we know exists and that we know a response to it, which is what other countries do, is that they have heavy scrutiny of everyone who comes into the country. Israel has really intense scrutiny of anyone who comes into the country through their airport, and they have very strong border controls. But no, I think the issue of feeling less free with Real ID doesn't quite make sense to me because if you have a social security number, they know where you live. If you have a passport, you mentioned that they know where you lived when you had to file for the passport, right? Like The whole issue is that traveling by plane in particular poses certain unavoidable risks of human intervention that we know exist because we've seen them happen. And those risks are so great, and the price of implementing Real ID is so minimal in if by comparison, that my opinion is that it's a good idea to have it. They've been trying to do it for decades, and they just kept delaying it and delaying it. But now it seems like they might actually be going forward with it from a law that was passed a long time ago.
I guess we'll see the next time I get on a plane. I'll let this publication know. But for now, I'll just try to stay grounded.
I'll just say I feel safer when thinking about air. It's also good for tourism to make people feel safer when traveling by plane, to know that there are some efforts being made to stop bad actors who would use planes in a way that they are not intended to be used.
Yeah, for planes, totally.
That there's a real, tangible effort being made to demonstrate that this is being taken as seriously as it can be. Short of locking people into the plane seats for the duration of a ride, this is certainly a step, right, in the direction of figuring out who every single person is that's traveling, but this isn't complete imprisonment while flying. This is just making sure that everybody who's flying on a plane is who they say they are. I don't see that it's that controversial.
Sure. No, to that I have no objection. Yeah, you gotta know who they are to fly on a plane.
The risks are just too high, right?
Yep.
It's just the way it goes. The one disagreement I'd have with Real ID is that some of the documents they're asking for may be very difficult to get for some people. That it effectively discriminates against the homeless, because some of the documents they're looking for are things like a utility bill or a lease or some kind of proof of residence. And if someone doesn't have a proof of residence, this is the same criticism that can be levied against passports, is that this effectively denies homeless people or people who decide not to have a permanent residence, who might not be homeless, who just like to travel because who live in hotels or something. It's effectively discriminating against them in certain ways because they'll have real difficulty providing documents that they can't provide. And so, at least in that sense, it does seem unfortunate, if not completely unfair, to deny a whole subset of people in the country who may legally be allowed to live in the country because they're citizens or they're born here and they just have the misfortune of being homeless or too poor, that it creates another barrier to air travel for them.
Sure. Yeah. For them, could they get a P.O. box?
You're right. I think it would be like a P.O. box, or if they live at a shelter, it would be the address of the shelter. It would be something like that. But it's just that bureaucracy has a way of putting impediments in front of people that makes it more difficult for them to get through the gatekeeping. And so the point I'm trying to make is that if you make it more difficult for people to do air travel, then some people will find it more difficult to engage in air travel, period, because they may not understand that they have to get a PO box, or they may not have the money if it costs money for a PO box. It's just a thing, right? That say somebody has an emergency, they want to go to a funeral for a family member, and they raise the money from charity or something to get that ticket to go fly on that plane to go to that funeral, but oh, they don't have the right ID, no, you can't go. And so, what are your alternatives? Your alternatives would be a bus or a train, right? Or I guess rent a car. Trying to think
Yeah,
of
rent a car, right?
go by boat, go on a boat around the country. I'm trying to think of what the way to get long distances would be. Probably a train.
Travel by riverboat. That'd be fun. Okay, yeah, no. And in the final analysis, I agree. Like, my favorite book series is the Foundation series and its prequels and sequels. And I won't do any spoilers, but one who has read all of them and remembers would see that the final analysis is one that we do live in an interconnected and ultimately interdependent society and world, and its survival takes priority.
Yeah, no, I saw the series. I haven't seen all of it, but I saw 2 seasons of it, not all three. I haven't read the books for Foundation, but the series is pretty good. But I'm reminded of the Star Bridge, the giant, or the space elevator, the giant entry to the Empire, of the problems of not having adequate ID for what happened there. If you've seen the show, that was pretty dramatic.
I have not seen that one.
Oh,
More
yeah.
things for the watch list.
Yeah, if you read the books, it's pretty good.
Elon Musk to be absentee founder of Doge. Will Tesla ever recover? They're down a bunch. I know it's 70% in something, but I can't remember if it's stock price or sales or what it is, but that's what they say, 70%. Is Tesla through? Does this mean Doge has run its course? So what do you think? First of all, will Tesla recover?
I think so. If Elon Musk has proven anything over time, is that he's this magician with the markets and being a hype man. If he were to distance himself from Doge and being involved in government and just focus on the fundamentals, on selling the product and finding new markets and all that, I think it'll survive. I just don't think it'll be at the highest it's been. I think those vaunted heights that it's been at very high price, not happening anymore. There was a choice made by choosing to participate in politics to the degree he has, in as public a way as he has, that he turned away at least some of the consumer base away from buying Tesla ever again. That there was a choice made, and that choice for sure has had a material impact on people wanting to buy Tesla or continue owning the one that they have instead of selling or trading it in for something else. And it's not so clear, at least right now, that's ever going to change, because when you fire thousands of people from their jobs and you spend over $100 million supporting a candidate who engages in what are unprecedented practices with respect to the American government, that's going to have an effect, right? People do, in fact, spend their money based on their values, and it doesn't reflect their values, as we've seen, to support Tesla anymore, at least for some people. That's why there's protests. That's why there's the vandalism, is that it's not just about having a good product, it's also how people feel about the product, right? That's why we saw when there was a boycott of apartheid South Africa. I'm sure the products that they were selling and creating were just fine. It's people didn't want to support an apartheid regime. And so there was a real effort to divest from South Africa, and that had a material impact. The same could be said right now with Musk and Tesla, is that unfortunately, Musk has a real marketing and PR problem that he doesn't seem to quite get, that like the things he says and the things he does have a direct link to people being willing to buy Tesla. The most visible example that I remember was when it was alleged that he had that Nazi salute, and he said, "Oh, that wasn't really a Nazi salute. It sure to some people looked like one." And then making fun of people for saying it looked like one instead of immediately disavowing Nazis was a bad look, right? Just a bad look. The other example for sure that I recall that certainly didn't make Germany happy was when he showed up in that video screen for the German far right party rally. There was a rally during their election for, I think it's the AFP is what they're called. And Elon Musk showed up supporting the candidates. Like, the people who are espousing ideas and beliefs that are anti-liberal, and there's Elon Musk, this guy who's trying to sell cars that were supposed to be environmentally friendly electric vehicles for the future. Oh, by the way, here we're supporting this like very backward looking kind of belief system. Not a great look. There's this weird cognitive dissonance that's going on where it's buy my stuff. Oh, by the way, I have some beliefs that people really disagree with, but still buy my stuff.
Sure, yeah. The guy who might allegedly have done a Hitler salute, shown up at it's not even allegedly, it is the far right party of Germany. Not a great combination. You generally want to distance yourself from Nazi stuff everywhere, but especially in Germany. Yeah, I don't bet. Attempting to put myself into the mind of Elon Musk, it's previously what percentage of Americans would have bought an electric car from him prior to his political involvement. How many of them were going to do it? I don't know, 20, let's say. But then if every Republican did it, maybe that's more. Who knows? And it's probably not all a business maneuver either. He probably has ideas. He definitely has ideas. But if people, instead of buying those oversized trucks, bought Teslas, then that would be good. But for some time, at least for like the next 10 years or so, a bunch of people are gonna just have a vendetta in a certain respect against Tesla.
The tariffs on China, if they continue to stay at the level they're at, are going to severely impact Tesla's ability to sell in the Chinese market and the American market. If you've listened to Musk, he's been vocal about not wanting tariffs at all, right?
Yeah,
And there's a reason for that. It's because so much of auto manufacturing and selling based off of the impact of tariffs, all the parts, all the markets.
next topic. Old PDH at it again, sharing Telegram chats. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, takes information from a secure channel, and minutes later, it shows up on a Signal chat. I don't know why this is humorous to me. It just seems like a comedy of errors. Where's the accountability here? We hear that if you do things that you're not supposed to do in a job, that you then won't have the job. But it doesn't seem like it right now. What do you make of this?
I make of it that if the Democrats win in the midterms, both the House and the Senate, that Pete Hegseth, if he's still Secretary of Defense after the midterms, is going to be first in line to be impeached. Look, a mistake one time, okay, you're new on the job, you admit to the mistake, you don't do it again. This is more than just a single mistake. He started the Signal chat. He invited a whole bunch of people to the chat who had no business knowing any of the information that was discussed. Apparently, he transcribed verbatim information that he received from somebody in the theater of war, right? Relaying that information in real time to him. And then he relayed that information to a not as secure chat. Not good, right? None of that's good. But then the newest news today is that apparently he had an internet line put into his office that was unsecured, that wasn't part of the secure internet, the SIPRNet, which is no, absolutely not. So what I make of it is that this is very scary. It's not humorous. It's a comedy of clowns, right? That there's the clown car and that every single day it seems like there's this general incompetence that just emanates from the Trump administration. But it's scary. So I grew up on military bases. We had drills. There were bomb threats. There were risks involved with living and going to school on a military base when you live abroad that are real. They're not. There's no ambiguity there, right? That there are people who want to hurt America, and one way to do that is to attack a military base. For example, every time I would try to enter or leave the military base as a dependent, they have heavily armed guards with really big guns, and they check everyone's ID, and you have to go through a whole checkpoint and process, and it takes time, right? But there's no ambiguity there to why the guards are necessary because they're a target, right? That the base is a target. In the same case, the people who are flying the planes into a war zone, because Yemen is currently in a civil war, and dropping bombs in a war zone on people who are the revolutionaries, as it were, in the civil war, the non government of Yemen folks, the Houthis, right? The Houthis have weapons that are capable of shooting things out of the sky. It was made clear in all those hearings. And so this is no laughing matter, right? Like in any other administration, it would be very clear that he would be out the door. He'd be fired. There's no excuse for the Waltz chat. Okay, fine. It was a chat that was started by Waltz, and he was just part of the chat. Okay, whatever. But already there was no excuse there because they didn't adequately vet everybody on the chat. No, they didn't have some staff who just sat there going, yes, all these people have clearances. Everybody who's supposed to be here or allowed to be here is here before any of that information was shared. That's whatever. The second example, though, it's egregious. There's no universe in which Hegseth doesn't know that his personal lawyer, his wife, his brother, it's not so clear that all of these people had any business knowing the attack plans or the real time updates of planes flying into a place and dropping bombs. It wasn't clear why that information had to be shared at all. And so it's a carnival show. And if you elect in a clown, expect a circus, right?
I saw that meme recently. And it's probably a saying prior to the meme, but I saw a meme involving that.
It is a saying prior to the meme, but the whole point of it is that these are people with jobs that are so serious and so important. And to have just such flagrant disregard for the severity of what's going on here, where they go, oh, this was just information for the media, or oh, the journalist somehow got a hold of this information and oops, oopsie daisy, or oh, it's just on Signal, no big deal. It's like, yes, big deal. There's a reason that all those safeguards are in place for this information being communicated. Why there's CIPRNet and the other stuff, those exist for a reason, right?
Hey man, chill. I just shared it on Snapchat. It goes away immediately.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, in such jobs, and an example, a less severe example, was my wife works in a job that involves patient confidentiality. And she doesn't even tell me, like, the names of her clients. She doesn't tell anybody. And if you're related to somebody in such a job, you just get used to not hearing about stuff, or hearing only the basics after the fact. Like, sometimes way after. The culture has evolved a lot since World War II, where my grandfather didn't talk about any of it for many years afterward. And then we heard bits and pieces late on in his life, but could you paint a coherent story? No. And he certainly wasn't copying it directly into a chat. And people who've worked in such a place would know that. And they would expect that you just wouldn't share things. And things don't need to be shared. You don't need to gossip about things, folks. No laughing matter.
Also, the expectation when someone's sending that information to their boss, right? Because if it's a general sending it to the Secretary of Defense, it's effectively someone sending the information to the boss and then the president. There's an expectation that nobody else who needs to know that information knows that information, period, because it's very time sensitive. There's no reason for anyone else to know that information other than the principals involved. It's just the way it is. But anyways, did we want to talk about this anymore?
I think we can move on to Rubio.
I'll say one more thing on this, and then we can move on to Rubio. The president isn't the only one that can fire secretary or cabinet secretary. A cabinet secretary can, in fact, be impeached. And so, if the Democrats really do regain power, I would fully expect them to try to impeach Hegseth and maybe even get him thrown in jail for a while for violating the Espionage Act, because this is very serious. There's no, it's not a laughing matter. It's jeopardizing the safety, and people in these positions need to take the jobs they have very seriously. There's no ambiguity. It's not a frat party. No bragging about it. They've thrown other people who've released much less information into prison for decades. So there's no excuse. Someone in that level of authority and position has to set the standard, not make a laughing stock of the standard, because it really hurts morale if they hold everybody in a lower position than them to a completely separate standard than the standards they're imposing on themselves. There's just no way around it.
We'll see you next week here on Mondays with Mike.